Space. The gap between two adjacent ribs and intercostal space. The gap between two adjacent ribs and their costal cartilages is called the intercostal space. Posteriorly, there are 11 intercostal spaces between the 12 ribs on either side. Anteriorly, there are only 9 intercostal spaces, as the 11th and 12th ribs are floating in nature and lack the anterior attachment. Contents. Each intercostal space contains intercostal muscles, intercostal nerves, intercostal arteries, intercostal veins, intercostal lymph vessels and lymph nodes. Typical intercostal space. Third, fourth, fifth, and sixth intercostal spaces are known as typical intercostal spaces, as these spaces are intervening between typical ribs and traversed by vessels and nerves which are only confined to thoracic wall. Intercostal muscles. The muscles are arranged in 3 layers from superficial to deep. External intercostal muscle, internal intercostal muscle, transversus thoracis muscle. All intercostal muscles are supplied by intercostal nerves of the spaces in which they lie. External intercostal muscle. The muscle has 2 parts, fleshy and membranous parts. From the tubercle of the rib posteriorly to the costochondral junction anteriorly, it is fleshy. Between the costochondral junction and the sternum, it is replaced by anterior intercostal membrane. Origin and insertion arises from the lower border of the rib above the space and inserted into the outer lip of the upper border of rib below. Direction of fibers. The fibers are directed downwards, forwards and medially. Action. Elevate the ribs during inspiration. Internal intercostal muscle. The muscle has 2 parts, fleshy and membranous parts. From the lateral border of sternum in front to the angle of rib behind it is fleshy. Behind the angle of rib, it is replaced by posterior intercostal membrane. Origin and insertion arises from the floor of costal groove of the rib above the space and inserted into the inner lip of the upper border of rib below. Direction of fibers. The fibers are directed downwards, backwards and laterally. Action. Depress ribs during expiration. Transversus thoracis muscle. It is made up of three distinct muscles, namely the SUBCOSTALIS, the Intercostalis intimus, and the STERNOCOSTALIS. Intercostalis intimus. It occupies the middle 2/4 of a typical intercostal space. This muscle is absent in upper two spaces. Intercostal vessels and nerves run between internal intercostal muscle and intercostalis intimus muscle. Hence, this interval is known as neurovascular plane. The structures in the neurovascular plane are arranged in the order from above downwards: intercostal vein, intercostal artery, intercostal nerve. Origin and insertion. Arises from the ridge above the costal groove of the rib above the space and inserted into the inner lip of the upper border of rib below. Direction of fibers. The fibers are directed downwards, backwards and laterally, same as internal intercostal muscle. Action. Depresses the ribs during expiration. SUBCOSTALIS. Present in the posterior part of lower intercostal spaces only. Lies in the same plane as intercostalis intimus muscle. Origin and insertion. Arises from the inner surface of rib above the space near its angle and inserted into the inner surface of the lower ribs after crossing one or two spaces. Direction of fibers. The fibers are directed downwards, backwards and laterally, same as internal intercostal muscle. Action. Depresses the ribs. STERNOCOSTALIS. Present behind the sternum and costal cartilages. It will be in the form of 4 or 5 muscular slips which run superolaterally from the sternum to the costal cartilages. Origin and insertion. Arises from the posterior surface of lower part of body of sternum. Xiphoid process and also from adjacent 4th to 7th costal cartilages. The fibers pass upwards and laterally and get inserted into posterior aspect of costal cartilages of 2nd to 6th ribs. Action. It assists in pulling the costal cartilages in which it is inserted.